Hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to listen to our discussion on carbon accounting, carbon credits, carbon dioxide, carbon flow calculations, questions regarding life cycle assessment calculations and biogenesis. Agriculture, especially the ruminant, has been vilified over the last couple of years as a major player in global warming and climate change. One reason for making the ruminant the villain in global warming and climate change is the values the people took for their calculations. They assumed that they could take industry standards and apply the same calculations to the agricultural sector that is a living system, rather than a linear calculation of emissions only. The agricultural sector, regardless of product farmed, is never an emissions-based only industry. Photosynthesis plays a part in all food production systems. And as soon as you have photosynthesis, carbon is taken from the atmosphere and we have a carbon sink or a decline in the carbon atmosphere content. Our discussion today will concentrate on the various carbon calculations, carbon flows, etc., how the calculations were done in the past, what must change and what must be included in the calculations to achieve a more balanced and accurate result that resembles the dynamic nature of a living system. The discussion will revolve around pasture-raised animal protein rather than discussing every animal production process, from intensive monogastric production and beef feedlot systems. These aren't natural systems. Even if food production for intensive farming systems can be processed regeneratively, an intensive animal protein production system on its own does not have carbon sinks that can be taken into account to mitigate their emissions. We will also include in the discussion the advantages of regenerative agriculture, adaptive grazing management systems, soil robustness, increasing water penetration and water retention of the soil, increased biomass and increased biodiversity. What is the farmer being paid for? What is currently measured, and what should be included in these measurements? Context drives everything. Even in this discussion today, every production unit is different. Science is reductive so that we as humans can comprehend it. Our discussion today is about carbon that is a cycle that is stored in every living organism, from the soil bacteria, plants, insects and mammals, where we have the living systems living off sugars excreted as root exudates and dung beetles burying dung, where we have methanotrobes using methane to multiply. We are not talking about a linear calculation, but a complex, wicked system that science does not fully comprehend. And with that, I'd like to welcome Professor James Blignaut, who's done quite a bit of work on carbon accounting, carbon credits, and also biogenesis in it. James, just as a start, can you actually give us some insight into your work that you have done over the years, where you have published several papers regarding carbon accounting, carbon credit and CO2 emissions?
Good morning, Gerry, and to the listeners. And thank you for having this discussion. I think it's an essential one and a very valuable one to have. So I'm an economist, and I've been working in this field of natural resource economics. So it's basically this interface between the economics and natural resources, natural resource management, and natural resource behavior. So the key focus within this broad field of the economics of natural resource management was on and is on the economics of restoration. So what does it cost to restore degraded landscapes, and what are the benefits of restoring degraded landscapes? The costs are relatively easy to calculate because those are on the books, financial costs. So it is going to cost you so much in terms of labor, in terms of equipment, etc. So on the cost side, it is relatively simple because all of that calculations are already recorded within a financial system. It is the benefit side that is a bit more tricky, because once you start to think in terms of the benefits of restoring degraded landscapes, you are talking about ecosystems and ecosystem services that you're going to enhance. Ecosystems would then be like grasslands, forests, wetlands are the big ecosystems. And then the ecosystem services that we get from it would then be climate amelioration, is the big word for sort of stabilizing global climate. It would be carbon sequestration as a facet thereof. It would be nutrient cycling. It would be pollution control, water retention, water flows. There are about 70 ecosystem services that we can get from these ecosystems. And the farm is an ecosystem. Whether it's the Karoo, whether it is the Free State, doesn't matter where it is located, whether it's high rainfall or low rainfall, the farm is within an ecosystem and an ecosystem in and by itself. And it is generating a lot of ecosystem services. The protein that you spoke of that is being produced on a farm, that is one ecosystem service. We call that the provisioning services, the fancy word for it. It's a service that the farm is providing. But in farming and in managing the farm, a host of other services are also being produced. Water retention, water treatment, nutrient cycles, but then also the carbon cycle that is being affected. And so through our work, we have tried to highlight what those ecosystem services are and what those cycles are that happens as a result of restoring degraded landscapes, and then very important, then also maintaining those landscapes and then maintaining the farm. And it is a very exciting journey because in the process we're able to then sort of start to track what the flow of the carbon is through that ecosystem, which we then call the farm.
If you take your work that you've done over the couple of years now, just to actually explain that you've actually done quite a bit of work in regards with carbon emissions and biogenesis, and that not necessarily the papers. We'll get to your papers just now, but what qualifies you to actually talk about this subject a bit? Yeah,
so I started my career in the mid-90s as an accountant, economist that accounts. So my thesis, my PhD thesis was environmental accounting in South Africa. So I'm an economist that counts, and for the past 30 plus years, I've been counting things in the natural environment. So it has been a very exciting journey to be both from a financial perspective, economic perspective, but being totally absorbed by the natural environment and natural resource managers and natural scientists that work in the natural field. So ecologists, biologists, animal scientists. My closest friends are soil scientists, ecologists, and biologists, and me being the economist among them that counts things. So I don't have any formal training within physiology or chemistry or physics. I come from an economic perspective, but you learn through osmosis and you learn through having good teachers that are ecologists and animal scientists and soil scientists. And so over the year, we've tried to build a multidisciplinary team that focus on all the various different aspects of it, because since the farm is an ecosystem, you need multiple number of disciplines, multiple number of skill sets to be able to actually engage with what happens on the farm. And in a sense, my role is in the back end of the process, because the colleagues, the friends, the researchers are working on the establishing the different processes that is happening on a farm, and my role then is to look at it from an economic and perspective, counting the molecules, and eventually, hopefully, also then counting the rands and cents that comes off it. What we must make perfectly clear at the start of the discussion is that we are a carbon-based life, and that carbon is always part of a cycle and gets stored or bound in various forms during the carbon cycle. James, could you just explain a bit the various forms of carbon and how it does get stored? Yes, so carbon is a natural occurring element in nature. And you have mentioned it in the introduction that it has been vilified, and unfortunately so, because it is the building block of life and energy. And you can have it either in a fixed form, or then in a solid form, or in a gaseous form, or in a liquid form. And because you can have it in a various one of these different forms, it also can flow among and between these different forms. So it can go from a solid form to a gas form. So it can go from coal, which is then in a solid form, into a gas form when you burn it. It can also go into a liquid form. Um, and those fluxes or those changes happens constantly because it can move from one form to another form. It can also bind with various different elements. Carbon can bind with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. It can bind with hydrogen to form methane. And it can flip between these different combinations, these different composites as well. So it is highly mobile and flows through the system the whole time. And therefore, carbon can also be stored on a farm in different what we call carbon pools. There's a grass pool in which the carbon is. There would be the cattle and the sheep, um, where carbon can be stored in. That's in a sort of in the live animals. Then it's obviously in the soil, but in different forms. It can be in the organic matter and the biology that is in the soil, but then it can also be in this part of the soil organic carbon, which is then the more long-term form of the carbon stored in the soil. But then it can also be in a fossilized form, which is then way down in the crust of the earth, be it then in a liquid form, a gas form, or then in a solid form. So various different pools. What makes the farm exciting is that the farm, through the farm management, can actually influence the amount of carbon that is stored in these different pools on his or her farm going forward. So the management has got a big effect and a big influence on where and in which pool this carbon is being stored.
For clarity purposes, now just on the carbon accounting side and the carbon credits and the life cycle assessment in that, can you explain the difference between the different measurements and why they are integrated but must not be confused as being the same measurement or having the same meaning?
Yeah, this is a key question, Gerry, because from a carbon credits perspective and how the carbon credit rules are working, and for farmers that would like to attain carbon credits, there's only one pool that qualifies for carbon credits, and that is carbon that is stored in soil organic carbon. Um, that is the mineralized form thereof. All the other pools, be it then carbon that is there because you've got more dung beetles or more earthworms and more organic matter and more microbial activity, and you've got even more grass and you've got more animals on the farm. All the carbon that is in these other pools do not count from a carbon credits perspective. It's only the amount of carbon that is in the soil organic carbon pool that matters for carbon credits. And we can perhaps look later at why that might be the case. So, whereas when we think in terms of the intensity of producing a product, be it wool, be it milk, be it protein, it doesn't beef, it doesn't matter. Then you actually look at the entire carbon system and all the different pools that's on a farm, not just the one soil organic carbon pool. Then when we think in terms of it in a life cycle assessment perspective, and we calculate the carbon intensity of a specific product, then all the other pools come into play, which is then obviously different from when you think in terms of carbon credits, where only the one pool come into play. So you from a life cycle assessment perspective, we think in terms of what would be the carbon emissions um, relative to the production of 1 kilogram of wool or the 1 kilogram of milk or beef. Then you look at the entire flow on a farm, what has happened on the farm. All the other pools are then considered to be included as well in the calculations. Carbon credits, only the soil organic matter and the changes therein that that is of importance. So it's related, the subjects are related, but they are different. And I think there's often confusion about it in terms of what the carbon footprint of a farm is. And then immediately you jump from carbon footprint of a farm to soil organic matter and carbon credits, where there's actually a big difference because the carbon footprint of a product involves all the pools. Everything that is being stored on a farm, all the carbon that's being stored on a farm, and obviously also released through the actions. Whereas from a carbon credits perspective, it is much narrower, only on the soil organic carbon.
If we take the life cycle assessment calculations, these take the carbon flow into account and are used to measure the CO2 footprint of a product. Can you go into a bit more detail of what is used in the life cycle assessment calculations for a ruminant and what calculations are or were used?
Yes, so this goes to the heart of the work that we've been doing the past 2 years. And here I have to acknowledge various groups of people that have been involved. So the International Wool and Textile Organization, Cape Wools, the Milk South Africa, and various industries that have been recognizing this fact that a farm is an ecosystem producing a lot of ecosystem services, and that we have to look at it much more inclusively. Because in years past, life cycle assessment only concentrated on the emission side of things. So when we speak about emissions, it is the enteric fermentation, the cow burps, and all the methane that is contained therein, and then also all the manure emissions, and then all the emissions related to external inputs, be that diesel, petrol, electricity, fodder, etc. Now, there's no denying that. Let's say that right off the bat. There's absolutely no denying the fact that there's a lot of methane being produced on a farm by the animals. Absolutely no denying that. There's no denying that there's external inputs used, fuel, electricity, fodder, etc. And that producing them does generate emissions. The problem is that how it has been done in the past is that it was exclusively focused on those emissions, negating or ignoring the fact that a farm is a system and where photosynthesis is also occurring on. The result thereof is that the carbon intensity that has been assigned to products have been very high. In the case of wool, for example, about 24 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of raw wool, which is quite big, and that has given wool and all other natural textiles a very bad reputation. But because of new standards, one standard in particular, ISO 14067, that does recognize biogenesis. And biogenesis it's the biology that has got or carbon that has got a biological genesis. So that's what biogenesis means. It's carbon that has got a biological start, biological origin. By acknowledging that, we also have to incorporate the carbon that has been generated through the process of photosynthesis, or that carbon that's been drawn down to the farm. So the calculations and the accounting has changed. And so what we do now is we do admit and we do calculate all the on-farm emissions and releases of carbon, carbon dioxide, methane, etc. But instead of just leaving it as is, as if a cow is a motor car that just drives on tar and emits carbon, we now allow for the fact that a cow stands on grass and it eats the grass, and that grass is a large portion of carbon that has been drawn down from the atmosphere. And so by allowing for that, the equation is basically now what is the drawdown carbon through photosynthesis minus the greenhouse gas emissions, the methane and the other emissions. And now the portion of the net release to the atmosphere is much less. And depending the scenario, it is somewhere between 40 and 100% less of what the original estimations have been. And it's got massive implications for the industry, for all livestock industries, because the moment that you acknowledge that the farm is an ecosystem with all sorts of cycles in there. Now, in the past, the reporting systems did not allow for that. Fortunately, through the work that we've done and many other people around the world, the sentiments are changing and people are starting to realize that they have to acknowledge the drawdown component as well. And the moment that you acknowledge this drawdown component, the carbon footprint changes dramatically, not just marginally. And hopefully the sentiment around naturally produced products, fibers as well as then proteins, will change quite soon, because it's sad to say that while many of us that works and lives on farms are well familiar with the process of photosynthesis, if it was not for photosynthesis, there would not have been grass on our farms. And so it's sort of a common sense to us. Unfortunately, the account, how it has been accounted for in the past, did not acknowledge that. And so it has received a very bad flag and a very bad sentiment, all the naturally produced products. Hopefully, through this work, these sentiments can be changed going forward. And hopefully the sentiment change can be quite rapid because of the devastating consequences of what it has received because of too narrow a focus, by focusing only on greenhouse gas emissions and not on the photosynthesis sequestration component, which obviously is a huge omission and actually a fault in this entire process.
James, can you explain a bit the train of thought of CO2e, the equivalent, the carbon dioxide equivalent, especially then also the methane cycle, how that actually does work if methane goes into the stratosphere and to just actually give a bit of a background on that as well, please.
Yeah, so there are a range of what is called greenhouse gases. And the most notable ones would be carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And according to the scientists, they have got different impacts on the global climate once they've reached the upper stratosphere. And because they've got different impacts, in order to be able to add them together, they've been given different global warming potentials. So methane's global warming potential currently, according to the most recent IPCC report, is 27. So what it says is that over 100-year lifespan, a methane molecule has got a global warming potential 27 times that of carbon dioxide. And in order to be able to compare apples with apples, this concept of CO2e, or CO2 equivalent, has been concocted. It's very important to realize that CO2e does not exist in nature. It actually exists nowhere else outside of the human imagination. It is only lives in Excel and various other models. It lives nowhere else. So in nature, you don't have something called CO2e. You've got CO2, carbon dioxide, you've got methane, you've got nitrous oxide, etc. But from an accounting perspective, in order to be able to add all of these greenhouse gases together to say what would be the composite effect of these different greenhouse gases, this fabrication has been made called CO2e. Now, I'm not discrediting it. I'm using it a lot. It is a very useful metric to have, and to be able to take all the different gases and express it in a singular metric, CO2e. But it is important to note that it does not exist in nature. So once we would like to understand what happens on a farm, this idea of CO2e is not really very helpful because it doesn't exist there. And this speaks to the B part of what you're asking, or what your question in terms of the methane cycle. Now, given that that is the biggest greenhouse gas source of greenhouse gas on a farm, linked to the enteric fermentation, the burping of the cows and the sheep, um, we need to unpack it a little bit more. So, methane is the uh, chemical equivalent there of a CH4. So it's a carbon molecule that binds with 4 hydrogen molecules to form CH4. The, the cow does not eat CH4. It eats the grass in which you have carbon, and there will also be some hydrogen in there. But in the rumen, the methane is being formed through fermentation process, and the cow, the sheep, the ruminants have to get rid of this methane that build up in the rumen, and that happens through the burping. And so now the methane is being released. But the methane that's being released has got a very interesting pathway. The first pathway, the first thing that it will hit is that as the cow walks with its head down grazing and then emitting the methane, is that there's something called a methanotrope, which is a soil bacteria that actually generates its energy from methane. And so immediately there's a scrubber and that methanotrope will then lifts off the methane, absorbs the methane, and then pull that down into the soil into various other forms of sugars and biology. But then the balance is then released. And then, and this is now here at the lower parts of the atmosphere, also then called the troposphere where we live. And then in about 90 days, this molecule will sort of rise up and reach a very thin layer, very delicate layer of gas between this lower troposphere and the upper stratosphere. And there it will meet what we call the hydroxyl radical. This hydroxyl radical is a phenomenal molecule, OH. It's just OH, it's an oxygen hydrogen composite. Very short-lived molecule. It lives less than a second, and it acts as a scrubber. So it scrubs out the methane and sort of deconstruct it into both CO2 again and also water, H2O. So it acts as a phenomenal scrubber. Unfortunately, it is not just looking for methane to scrub out methane. It also scrubs out carbon monoxide, CO. So the more carbon monoxide, CO, there is in the atmosphere, which comes from industrial processes and fire and motor cars, so the more carbon monoxide you have, the less methane will be scrapped out because there's a restricted number of hydroxyl radicals in the atmosphere. So its ability to scrap out the methane is then compromised if there's a lot of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. So, in that sense, the more fires you have, the more industrial activity you have, the more motor cars you have, the capacity of these radicals to scrub out the methane is compromised. That means the methane is then that are not scrubbed out, that's not converted into CO2 and water, is then permitted to go up into the higher stratosphere. It is in the stratosphere where it is considered to be a greenhouse gas and where it is considered to contribute to global climate change. And but methane is unlike any of the other greenhouse gases, it is a short-lived molecule. It lives between 10 and 13 years, and then it is deconstructed. There's a very delicate, very detailed, very technical process that happens. It's not as if it's a switch that's one day it's on and then another day it's off. No, it's a very dynamic process. But let's just work with 10 to 13 years, more or less, during which time the methane will then be deconstructed and then come back into the lower troposphere, either as carbon dioxide or as water. And that means that while it is in the atmosphere, it does have this global warming potential. No denying that. This is a term that I've sort of formulated for myself, is that you've got stratospheric respiration. The stratosphere is respiring the methane out of the stratosphere after a 10 to 13 year period. And it is this stratospheric respiration that is nowhere, in no accounting system currently, is acknowledging the fact that the methane is returning to the lower troposphere. And which means that, unfortunately, the current accounting systems only account for the methane as it is being released by the ruminant, by the cow, by the sheep, and all other wild animals, ruminants like kudu and bosbok, eland, and so on. That's being released by them, as if it is never returning back to the atmosphere, never returning to the troposphere, which is not true. And unfortunately, for this oversight, this omission, again, agriculture is receiving a big flack. So this is a second aspect. The first one that we've highlighted earlier is that it was only emission, only calculations, but we've dealt with that. This is a second big flaw in the accounting system, and that is that the fact that methane returns back in the form of carbon dioxide and water is not being acknowledged. And we have a long battle ahead of us to actually address this very problem. Just to conclude this part of what you've asked is that for as long as the number of cows remains constant, the herd size remains constant, the methane in the stratosphere will remain constant. It's only when the herd size increases dramatically that the amount of carbon methane in the stratosphere, because of cows or then sheep, ruminants, will increase. For as long as the herd size remains constant, it will also remain constant, because it's an in and an out system. And if the herd size declines, then obviously the concentration level of methane over time declines. It's nowhere in any of the accounting systems that these aspects of, and this is now we're talking about physics and chemistry, is not entering into the accounting systems at the moment, which is a big oversight.
If we look at the life cycle assessment calculations for a ruminant again and compare that to the biogenesis method of calculating the CO2 footprint of pasture-raised animal protein, what sinks have been added to the calculation, and why is it more accurate than taking the life cycle assessment emissions values only?
Because farm is not a factory, because cows are not cars driving on a tar road. The thing that has been added is this whole photosynthesis component, and it is so important because actually what we want to achieve on a farm through management is to actually accelerate the photosynthesis capability of a farm. Think for yourself at how the incentive mechanisms are working at the moment, or the disincentive mechanisms. Farms are, and especially livestock farmers, are getting a lot of flack for the amount of animals on their farm, and there's a drive to reduce livestock on a farm. And if that is going to happen, what is going to happen with the grass? It's going to become more moribund. It's going to become drier and moribund. And the natural thing of a dry, moribund grass is that it is going to burn. And when it burns, it releases carbon monoxide as well, ash, particulates into the atmosphere, which, as we've just said, is actually outcompeting the methane as up and the stratosphere competing for the hydroxyl radical. If, however, the grass have been grazed by livestock, then what is going to happen? That's going to stimulate regrowth of the plant. stimulating the regrowth of the plant does what? It accelerates the process of photosynthesis because the two are connected. The moment that the plant grows, that moment it starts to accelerate the uptake of carbon through photosynthesis. So now you're winning on both ends. You're reducing the risk of fires and also the frequency and the intensity of fires. You're reducing the fuel load on the farm. You're reducing the carbon monoxide in the atmosphere that is fighting for the attention of the hydroxyl radical. But you're also increasing rapidly the drawdown of the carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. So the focus here should not be on issuing a stick to the farmers, say, hey, this is the amount of methane emissions and how bad you are. The focus should much rather be on, so how much grass can you grow? How much can you actually contribute to the drawdown through photosynthesis? How much can you contribute to reduce the fire risk and reduce the competition up in the stratosphere? So in that sense, it becomes a very virtuous cycle. By actually actively managing the land, grazing the grass, by accelerating the process of photosynthesis and the drawdown of carbon, you're actually pushing more carbons also in the soil through sugars and root exudates in the process, generating much healthier soil biota. You're also reducing the risk of fire simultaneously. And that's why it is so important that from a life cycle assessment, that we have to consider the photosynthesis component and actually try to stimulate that and incentivize that component of farmers and say, how can farmers actually generate more biomass on their farms? And because the more biomass, the more drawdown, the less risk of fires, etc. And fortunately, as I've said, through this new ISO standard, ISO 14067, biogenesis is being recognized.
Thank you, James. And on the life cycle assessment and also on the biogenesis calculations, and that, just to highlight the fact that the biogenesis calculations are quantifiable. That it's not going from one era to the other. We've only done the emissions. Now all of a sudden we're going to go into a carbon, where carbon is stored and everything. Let's take the biomass. That all those different pools and that are quantifiable.
Absolutely, because one can identify those carbon pools, and then one can try to calculate what the carbon content of those pools are. Now, some are more difficult than others. There's no question about that. Quantifying the carbon pool in the soil microbes and the insects, etc., and the invertebra is difficult, but you don't have to go down to that level. The most important carbon pool from a biogenesis perspective would be the carbon that is contained within the grass or the biomass on the farm. And that's very much measurable. So in a sense, it is one of the simplest calculations to do. To calculate what the carbon content of the different grasses are. And not just can you do it for each farm through lab tests, which does take time and which is expensive. There's a plethora of literature that's available on what the carbon content of the different grass species are. And so grass species, Eragrostis is Eragrostis. And so there would be minor variations from farm to farm in terms of the carbon content, but by and large, it's going to be the same for Eragrostis, for example. And so you can calculate what the carbon content of a farm is, and then be able to say, pending the number of rotations, pending the number of times that you've grazed your land, you can calculate what the drawdown was. So if you're going to have a very extensive grazing farm where you're going to have a single drawdown in a year, is going to be different from a farm where you're going to have multiple drawdowns, where you're going to multiple grazing periods. So if you're going to graze a paddock 3 times, 4 times a year, you're going to be able to harvest more. Now, it depends from farm to farm, obviously. In a dairy context, which is planted pastures, you can have 10 up to even 13 rotations a year, which is definitely much different from a dryland system and an extensive grazing system. But it is very important to think how you're going to manage this farm. And the more that you can actually harvest the biomass without obviously over exploiting it, without uh, ruining your grass base, then you can actually improve the number of drawdown of the carbon that's being consumed. And that will reflect in the number of animals that you're going to be able to carry as well. So it's very quantifiable, like the emissions, also quantifiable. It's not necessary to calculate all the detail. But you can, it's sort of an 80-20 principle. If you can calculate the big ticket issues, then you've done well.
If we take the two industries that you published the papers on, the one your Destiny program, and then the other is the IW or the wallpaper that has just been published, and the specific findings that we looked at the biogenesis calculations for these two industries. Can you elaborate on your findings for those two industries, and what have you added to your calculations rather than just for the biogenesis calculations, and that rather than just the LCA or the life cycle assessment calculations?
So what we've done would be considered as life cycle assessment, but it's just a biogenic life cycle assessment. So it's still following the methodology and the approach of a life cycle assessment, but we are just incorporating the carbon drawdown for photosynthesis. Now, the wool work and the wool growing and the carbon intensity of wool does differ from that of milk production in one very important aspect, and that is the fact that the wool production by and large in most cases are done on large extensive operations, and so they're large big farms and it's dryland, and some of them are some of the case studies are done in a way that you can consider it in a regenerative mode. So it is using a multi-paddock system and multiple number of grazes or rotations a year. But it is a dryland system, and it is on a large scale, large farms. Whereas the dairy farms are obviously very much different operations. Yes, they're also pasture-based, but they're much smaller operations from an area base, and they are all planted pastures, all irrigated. So being planted pastures, you've got much more external energy that goes into it. So much more operations. Diesel, tillage, or most of them are using no-till, but many more passes of a tractor over that specific pasture. And that has got a big difference in terms of how the picture has been panning out. Because the amount of external energy and external money that goes onto a wool farm is so much less. Much less diesel per hectare, much less electricity per hectare, much fewer rotations on the dryland systems than with a dairy operation, where you have got lots of passes, lots of energy that you're putting onto a hectare, and multiple number of grazing rotations. As I've mentioned, some of the farms that we've worked on operates on 13 rotations a year. But it sort of varies between 9 and 13 rotations a year. Just to imagine a block of flats, that if you've got one rotation, only one graze a year, then you're only utilizing the ground floor of your farm. You've got 1,000 hectare farm, then you've got 1,000 hectare at your disposal. You only got the ground floor. if you're going to go for 10 rotations, so then you're adding on the same space of 1,000 hectares, you're adding floors. And so now the farm is no longer 1,000 hectares. Now your farm is 10,000 hectares, even though the physical size remains the same. You've got more times that you go there to graze that specific single pasture, and that has got a big effect on the overall calculations. Much more energy that needs to go there. It's much more expensive. It's irrigation, it is diesel, it is operations, it's labor. But because you're grazing it 10 times, you've got many more animals that you can carry per hectare, and you've got so much more photosynthesis taking place. Yes, where the dairy farms are located is a high rainfall zone, perfect, very good quality soils. Whereas on the wool side, it is per definition dryland, so it's not so intensive, much different climate. But the amount of drawdown on the dairy farms has been astounding because of the number of times that they are the number of rotations. And so in both cases, we have seen that it is possible for the wool production as well as the dairy production to actually draw more carbon from the atmosphere, carbon equivalent from the atmosphere, incorporating the methane's global warming potential, than what they are releasing, which is actually quite exciting. And what we have to realize, therefore, in looking at the different industries, wool and dairy that you've highlighted, is that there's no one size fits all because of the different characteristics thereof. You have to look at it very specifically. Wool, dryland, it is largely extensive operations, whereas the dairy is much more intensive, and you have to incorporate the degree of intensity in the calculations thereof. You cannot just use a normal system of calculation. You have to factor that fact that it's actually operating in a multi-story building, in a flat, into consideration.
Thank you, James. I mean, it's interesting to see that. I mean, if you take the values that you did get from the IWTO or from the wallpaper, let's stop using the IWTO just heading, the wallpaper and I mean also the dairy and that. Can you just give some figures on how much the sink was compared to the old calculations where you took the biogenesis calculations into account?
Yes, so let's focus on the wool. So the norm was around 24 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of raw wool. So 24 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, that was the sort of benchmark or rule of thumb for the carbon emissions. The moment that you start to incorporate photosynthesis, then it changes. That number declines, drops by between 40 and even 100, even 120%. How is it possible to say that it drops by 100 or 120%? The answer lies in terms of what happens with the carbon that is in the manure. Does that carbon that's in the manure get absorbed by the soil, or is it been respired out into the atmosphere? The healthier the soil is, the more microbes in the soil, the more the absorption of that carbon that's in the manure is in the soil, and therefore your carbon intensity of the product of the production will actually decline to the point that you actually can start to become carbon neutral, reducing the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere. And that we have seen also in the dairy farms, that you can actually, from the baseline of about 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram fat and corrected protein corrected milk, to minus 0.5, even minus 0.8. And that is very exciting, because what that means is that through management, you can actually change the system around from being net emitter to becoming a net sequester of carbon. But the key thing here is what amount of carbon that is in the manure is being absorbed by the soil or that is being released into the atmosphere. And that's purely management dependent. The healthier the soil is, the more demand there will be for the carbon and the other nutrients that's in the manure. The poorer the soil is, then the more of the carbon and the nutrients that's in the manure will be oxidated. So it's a management issue, Gerry.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you calculated just the manure net, so you didn't actually calculate the increased in biomass of, let's say, grass. If you take your dairies, for example, where they grazed it 10 times a year, you didn't actually work on the increased biomass of grass as such.
No, the biomass is very important. I mean, the biomass drives it. So it's the carbon that is in the biomass drives a lot of these calculations. The question would then be is what happens with the carbon? Of course, you follow it, you trace it through the entire system. A very large portion of the carbon that is being digested by the cow that was in the grass is getting excreted. So basically, if within 24 hours, you can even see it as the carbon pool that's above soil. There's the grass, and it contains, say, 10 tons of biomass. And then within 24 hours after grazing it, it has been excreted in the form of manure. Now, once it has been excreted in the form of manure, the question is, now where does that carbon go? If it is healthy soils, if there are a lot of microbes in the soil that is carbon hungry, then they will come and they will eat that carbon and it will draw it down into the soil. Typically, your dung beetles and your other invertebrate soil organisms will draw it down. If it is poorer soils, then the manure will lie on the soil surface, where the wind and the sun and the rain will make sure that it will then oxidate and it will then transpire into the atmosphere. So it is very important to see how fast can you actually get the drawdown into the soil, so that within a few days the manure paddies can actually disappear, sort of gone. And the answer is, where did it go to? If it has gone into the soil, then obviously the much better it is than when it is getting oxidated and transpired into the atmosphere. So you follow it through its life, right through its life cycle, starting as grass, being grazed. Where does it go? A portion is getting is released through enteric fermentation. A portion goes into milk. A portion goes into the actual body mass, and then a very large portion goes into the form of manure. And what happens with that manure is quite important for the overall calculations.
Okay. Yeah. In future, then, are there other markers that should be included in the calculation or in the biogenesis calculations that have not been acknowledged yet? So I think that is the one. It actually joins the last question as well, as carbon sinks in these two papers, and then especially also on the GHG standards and that the land sector and removal standards that has just been released in it. Can these sinks can they be included in the calculations, and are the emissions warranted? So the product, the increased biomass, grass, soil bacteria, and increased biodiversity. I mean, it's and you touched on the insects a bit earlier on, where you said you can't do, or not everything has such a big influence on the calculations. Are there other calculations or other drawdowns that you would actually like in to be taken into account in this whole both carbon accounting and life cycle assessment calculations?
Yeah, so because the farm is an ecosystem that renders ecosystem services, the carbon cycle is one cycle, very, very important cycle, obviously. But there are multiple number of cycles. There's the water cycle, that's very important. There's the nutrient cycle, that's very important, including then the nitrogen cycle. There's biodiversity. So I would really like to see in the long run that we also include those. So at the moment, carbon, the whole market is focused on carbon and carbon equivalent, methane, etc., from a global climate change perspective, driven by the IPCC and the UNFCCC, this big international bodies that governs the management of climate emissions, carbon emissions, and hence the focus on carbon. But we should never forget that the carbon cycle is just but one cycle. The water cycle, the nutrient cycle, the biodiversity are key elements, and they are mutually beneficial. So the moment that you're going to have more carbon drawdown in your soils, as I've just alluded to earlier, then the possibilities of water retention of the soil become so much better. It means that your ability of the nutrient cycles, the nitrogen cycle, becomes better. The moment that you're going to improve on those cycles, the possibilities of improving on the biodiversity becomes better. Not just the soil biodiversity, but also in terms of your bird life, also in terms of the natural predators on the farm. Here where we are, I've seen a massive increase in the number of cattle egrets. I've seen a big increase in the number of eagles. The disadvantage, the disservice, the disamenity of having more eagles on the farm is that they come for the drive-by and steal my chickens. But now I have got a chicken theft problem because of the eagles. But that's a different sort of problem to have, and they're daily. So I have to actually have somebody standing there next to the chicken coop chasing eagles away. But the biodiversity improves dramatically. The grass, the number of species within the grass starts to increase. I've also seen the protein content of my grass improving quite substantially. So there are multiple number of additional benefits that one is getting through managing your farm in a regenerative sense. The biogenesis component, the carbon component, is important from a carbon accounting perspective, but we should never ever forget that it's not the only cycle. There are many, many other cycles. And then there's obviously the animal welfare component that we also should not forget. The more robust the system becomes, the higher the natural resilience of a farm becomes, and the better you're actually caring for the animals as a whole. So the carbon cycle is one component thereof, but the farm does not exist only on the carbon cycle. And it is actually quite exciting that as we are seeing improvements on the carbon side of let's say regenerative farmers, we're also noting these other benefits, which actually very supportive to the entire farming operation as a whole.
I think that is what the crux of the matter is actually, to a certain extent. If we now take the carbon accounting and carbon credits into account, if you can actually just explain what must the farmer actually do to actually become part of such a program? And then secondly, James, if you could actually, and what is he paid? For what is he paid? So if you can actually explain exactly what is measured and what the time frames are that the verification bodies have put in place so that the livestock farmer can actually be paid on carbon credits. So soil samples, for example, how do we prove that if we're not talking about life cycle assessments now, we're talking specifically carbon credits and carbon accounting and the mineralized carbon in the soil. So if you could actually go into a bit more detail on that.
I think this is an important switch because previously we've spoken about the carbon footprint of a product, which is then measured in terms of the carbon intensity of that product. And we've looked at all the carbon pools on the farm and express that relative to the product that's being produced, whether it's milk, food, wool, or beef. What you're asking now is about carbon credits specifically, is only focused on the carbon accumulation in the soil organic carbon. So it's only that one pool that comes into play now. All the other pools are set aside, and it's almost as if it doesn't exist, because from a carbon credits perspective, it's only focused on the change in the soil organic carbon concentration in the soil. So when I say change in, it starts by taking a baseline measurement. Let's say if this farmer Joe, he wants to start with a carbon credits program on his farm today. You have to take a baseline measurement. Say, what is the carbon soil organic carbon content of the soil today? Let's say it's 2%, for argument's sake. And then that's this baseline, that's the starting point. Then this has to be measured then over time. And let's say that increases to a 2.5% in 10 years from today. Then that 0.5%, that change, that is what then is being qualified as under the carbon credits process, because that is what you have added to the system. The big word here is additionality. Has there been any additionality? That's the technical term that's been used. So the baseline component, that 2% with which you start, does not enter into the carbon credits discussion. That's just your starting point. It's only this change upwards from to a 2.5%, then that margin of 0.5% that you then can that you can then market as a carbon credit. The time frames that you're talking about is that the typical time frame that the carbon credits market is operating under is that it is assumed that the carbon must be stored for 100 years. That is a very, very long period for it to be eligible for carbon credits. Now, all of us will know that that is not possible. Nobody can actually guarantee 100-year storage, but that is the assumption under which it works. And in order to then come around the 100-year period, the people who made the rule said, okay, well, we recognize that 100 years are way too long. So we will hope that the carbon will be stored, that additional carbon of 0.5% that I've referred to earlier, will be stored for 100 years. But to make a contract practical, we will have to enter into a 30-year contract. So 30 year would be the typical length of a carbon credits project or a program with Farmer Joe. And that change over that 30 years will be monitored at different time intervals. Now, those time intervals will differ from contract to contract, but typically will be on, say, a 5-year period. So in 5 years from today, today is a starting period, 5 years from today, we will measure it again. And we will say, okay, what the increase have been then, and then 10 years and 15 years and so on. So at 5-year intervals. The way to do that is through taking then soil samples. That's one method. There are increasingly more methodologies coming into play through remote sensing and so on as well. But the standard way of doing it is then through soil samples. That soil sample is typically taken between 300 millimeters and 600 millimeters of soil depth. So it's 30 to 60 centimeters to take a soil sample and take it to a lab, analyze it, and determine what the soil organic carbon component of that soil is. It must be representative of the entire farm. So if your farm has got 5 different soil types, you've got northern slope mountains, you've got southern slope mountains, you've got areas which is in shadows, you have to make provision for all those different characteristics, features on the farm. So depending on the where the farm is located, the number of soil samples will differ. If it is one big Karoo farm, one soil type, and not much variation, then the number of test holes will be different from when you're sitting within a farm that has got much variation. That would be one sort of test to look at for carbon credits, would be then about the soil samples. The other one is to look at fire and fire risks. And will you be able to reduce the fire risk through a change in management? And if you can reduce the risk of fire and the fire frequencies and intensities and the fuel load, then obviously that will also be able to come into play. And I think especially in more extensively grazing systems and communal systems, etc., that becomes an important consideration. Can you, through improved management or change management, reduce the fire cycles? Let me conclude by saying that because you're measuring your change in the soil organic carbon stock due to a baseline, you cannot farm the way you farm the way you have farmed it up until that point where you've reached the baseline. Because then you're going to come in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years, and very little in that soil organic carbon stock would have changed. You'll have to introduce some form of change in the management of your farm in order to change the soil organic carbon stock. So if you've grazed it extensively for a long period of time, large camp system, single rotation system, then, and you have a very low carbon baseline, then by introducing improved management techniques, much more regenerative practices, etc., then you can add to your soil organic carbon baseline over time. I think I need to highlight here that there is a risk here that soil organic carbon does change over time under conditions of good and prudent management, but it's very slow. It is climate dependent and it's soil dependent. It is not just, okay, I changed my management plan and then the soil organic carbon will change. Climate sensitive and it's soil type sensitive. And it's obviously therefore not a guarantee. And yeah, 30 years is a very, very long period of time. And so it is. So there are a few factors that one just have to consider in the process when you start to engage in soil organic carbon trading. That is totally separate from the initial discussions that we've spoken about in terms of the intensity of the product.
Yeah, I think what makes it interesting, and it's really the two calculations that vary. So you've got your life cycle assessment and biogenesis, where you've got your various pools where you can actually increase your carbon in, and it is just by drawing down more carbon or CO2 through all the various pools, and we've mentioned them: grass, biomass, insects, soil bacteria, or soil life. And that you've actually you've increased your carbon on the farm or the various pools, but you don't necessarily increase your soil carbon, which is a more static and a longer time frame in that. Now, I think that is something that has to be highlighted in the carbon accounting side of it.
Yes, absolutely, and the soil type, because your silt is behaving differently from your clay and your more sandy soils. So soil carbon moves, can move in more silty soils, but in your clay and your sandy soils, soil organic carbon moves very, very difficult for soil organic carbon to move. Likewise, where it is very temperate climates and you've got higher rainfall, it is possible for soil organic carbon to move quicker. In arid environments, soil organic carbon moves very difficult. It's very slow to move. So if you have you're in an area which is very arid and very hot, and you have sandy soils, the chances, the probability of the soil organic carbon stock to move over time is limited. It's constrained, and even by the best management, it is constrained. So it is important to realize that it is not one canvas, one brush over everything here. It is definitely different. So if you've got nice silt soils and you have very good rainfall, then the chances of building the soil organic carbon with good management is just so much better. The problem, however, is that deep soils with good climate and high rainfall has already been used within a pasture context, and because those are very valuable land, and less so than for extensive grazing. For extensive grazing, it tends to be not necessarily always the case, but tends to be the more arid areas, and the more marginal soils. And the more marginal the soils are, the more difficult it is to build soil organic carbon stock. That's why it's more marginal. So it's not marginal because of anything else. It's just the properties within the soil and the climate on that context. You've referred to the word context earlier. Just makes it so much more difficult to build the soil organic carbon stock over time. Difficult does not mean impossible, eh? It's just a very big
Yes.
here. If I'm saying it's
Yeah.
difficult, doesn't mean it's impossible.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it's I think it's just the challenges that that a bee farmer or a livestock farmer has got, that he must take into account if he actually wants to look at the carbon credit, if he wants to be paid for it. I mean, the hurdle for him is so much higher than, for example, just a cash crop farmer. Could you actually go into that a bit? The difference between a cash crop farmer and also by the reduction of his inputs in that. But if you could actually just go into why is it different for different industries?
So even within the wool and dairy example that I've given, there's already a straight line comparison. The rands that a person, or the amount of money that a person is spending in an external setup per hectare compared to that of an intensive system is just so vastly different. You think you've got a 5,000 hectare Karoo farm. How much do you spend in terms of external inputs, external energy that you're putting onto a hectare compared to a 300 hectare dairy farm that is used multiple times per year? So the amount of carbon that you can actually sink and store on your farm is directly related to the amount of energy that you actually can spend on that farm and on that hectare. So if you are unable to, because of climate, because of soil, of location where you are, to spend a huge amount of money per hectare, in terms of external energy that you're putting onto it, the amount of carbon buildup that you're going to have there will just be much less than in a situation where you are spending a huge amount of energy onto that specific hectare. And that speaks to your question about crop farming. So if you're going to have, let's say, mealies, you're going to plant mealies, you're going to spend somewhere between 15 and 20,000 rand a hectare in planting that crop, with a lot of diesel that you're going to spend. So your capability and the number of places where you can actually reduce your emissions, as well as build carbon stock, is just so much more opportunity that you have than where you have a person that spends a few rand on a hectare because of the specific context in which he or she is. So from a crop farmer perspective, the options that a farmer has to reduce or to the carbon footprint would then be in terms of the diesel bill. So if you had a big diesel bill per hectare, and you switch and change your management practices, you can reduce the diesel bill. If you had a big fertilizer bill through change management from, say, a conventional deep tillage system, and you move to a no-till system and eventually to a regenerative system, you can reduce the amount of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, fungicides that you're putting in. And so you reduce your external input. And each time that you reduce your external input, that reduction is actually reducing that baseline. I've spoken about a baseline earlier. For extensive grazing farmer, livestock farmer, that baseline is how much soil organic carbon stock do you have? But for a crop farmer, it is how much carbon have you emitted in producing your crop, which is then the carbon in the emissions in all the fertilizers, the pesticides, the herbicides, etc., and the diesel. And then if you reduce that because of a change management system, then it's much easier to quantify. It's much easier to see because everything is billable. This is the amount of diesel I've bought. Now I'm buying this. This is the amount of fertilizer I've bought. Now that's the amount of fertilizer I've bought. So it's very simple to measure. And you can actually see those changes quite quickly, going from, let's say, a conventional till system to a conservation agriculture or a regenerative system. So it's different measurements that's being used. In a sense, it is simpler within a crop system and in an intensive system than what it is in an extensive system where you're spending much less amount of energy on that piece of hectare, and therefore your possibilities of the buildup of carbon and reduction of the emissions are simply less than what it is in context where you're spending a lot of money and a lot of energy on it. So you've just got simply more options available within your intensive systems than in your extensive systems.
Yeah, thank you, James. I mean, it is interesting, and if you take the discussion into account now, what we've actually spoken about it, and actually look at the complexity of the calculations and also what is being measured and what is being traded. I mean, it must be realized by the livestock farmer or producer that carbon trading and carbon credits are not the aim. And it is if he farms for carbon credits, it's really going to be difficult. It should rather be a surprise or a cherry on top if he does actually achieve does get a carbon accounting check or whatever. What cannot be ignored, though, and you've mentioned it earlier on as well, is on the different cycles, and that the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the nutrient cycles, and that as well that make up the farm, and that is by changing to an adaptive grazing system that benefits soil health. The farmer might not get carbon credits or carbon credit payment, but it does make his farm more robust and actually drought resistant. And now, if you take if you can actually elaborate on your team's work and the work that you do at Acid Research, and that where you do work with food production units that have implemented regenerative agricultural principles, namely the 6 principles of soil health. I mean, one is context. If you take minimum disturbance of both chemically and mechanically, soil cover, living roots, diversity, and animal integration. Can you, if you actually just elaborate a bit on the work that you've done with Acid Research and is it the profitability or the robustness of the soil and by the improved soil health? If you could actually just elaborate a bit on that, and where does regenerative agriculture actually fit into this whole thing?
Yeah, thanks, Gerry. So the couple of things to remark here. The one is that the issue around baseline that I've mentioned earlier. So the baseline on a crop farm is calculated differently from that of a wool grower or then a dairy. And because the context of these different branches are so much different. And it has taken us a while to figure out now what would be the real baseline of these different operations, because that does differ, and one needs to take that into consideration. The second one then is, after you've determined what the baselines are, is then what impact does management have on those baselines? Because in the end of the day, the baseline is one thing, but what we're really interested is the change in the baseline. Do you actually improve a situation, or are you deteriorating? Are you going backwards? And how can you improve that baseline? But here is where we ran into sort of a brick wall at some point in time, because like many others, we had, in a sense, also, may I call it, carbon blinkers on. We were only looking at the carbon thing because the entire world is only looking at carbon, and suddenly realized at some point in time that carbon is massively important, but the primary objective of a farmer is to actually produce a surplus, be that maize, be that protein, be that milk, be that wool, is to produce that surplus. And that you need this entire package in order to have a robust farm where the farmer can actually offer that farm to a future generation going forward. And that becomes actually a very important to look at the entire picture from a holistic perspective. That includes profitability. So in a sense, where and this is a very controversial subject, I know, but let me just raise it. In time past, the industry have been very yield focused. So what's my yield? And now yield is extremely important, but what keeps a farmer on the farm is not yield, it's profit. So you need both. You need yield and profit. And it is the farm's resilience and robustness by applying these different regenerative principles that you've mentioned, that you can actually generate both yield and do so profitability going forward. And that applies for a livestock farmer as well. How can you improve the robustness and the resilience of your farm and the profitability? I'm reminded of a story in 1992. I was a young researcher at the South African Reserve Bank of South Africa, and I've told my line manager that I wanted to do my PhD in environmental accounting. And the lady said to me at that point in time, but you must remember that sustainability, there is something like environmental sustainability, but you need financial sustainability first. So here at the bank, we're focused at financial sustainability. It does not take away the need for environmental sustainability, but financial sustainability is important. And I will never forget that discussion, because it was with that discussion that I went into my PhD, that you need both. You need a financial sustainability and an environmental sustainability for a farm to actually go forward. And the two can be mutually beneficial. And we've seen that now time and time and again. And it's actually very exciting, is how these two are mutually reinforcing. The more environmentally prudent farms are becoming, the more they manage the farms better, the more the carbon balance is improving, but more the money improves. And the reverse side of it is also true. So from an industry security perspective, from a national security perspective, from a food production security perspective, these things that you've just raised are phenomenally important. If we only chase yield, but at high external input costs, at extreme vulnerabilities to climate fluctuations, we're at risk. If we ignore yield and only farm with carbon, for example, or nutrients, then we're not going to have yield, then we're not going to have money, and then we're also at risk. We need both. And that is the exciting part, is that the more robust a farm becomes, by improving the diversity, by making sure there's a living root, by making sure the soil is covered, by making sure the carbon that's in the manure is being absorbed by the soil, the farm becomes financially more robust as well. Because it is eventually the financial robustness and the environmental robustness that keeps the farmer on the farm, even in times of adversity. And I find this that I'm just sharing with you, and I'm quite passionate about it, actually, is to be some of the most valuable things that has come out of this entire process. Yes, we've pushed the envelope on the accounting side, and very excited about that. And we've done some work on the various different techniques and management principles of how to improve farm management from a regenerative perspective. But it is this mutual beneficial co-relationship between environmental sustainability and financial sustainability, keeping a farmer on the farm, building that resilience, is probably the most exciting bit, because the social implications, keeping the farms on the farm, mean the town, the dorpie still functions. The moment that the farmer leaves the farm, the dorpie collapses, and sadly we've seen that too many times.
Just to cover the carbon discussion now that we finish it, if you could actually just comment on both compost and biochar and that as well. And I know there are programs where the people want to make biochar because it's a stable product and actually put that into the soil and say, well, I've got my 30 years of carbon in the soil, I've increased it by X. One, the value of adding external carbon, and secondly, of such a program.
I'm fully aware of biochar projects and so on, and I think it needs to be measured the ways that I've described, baseline, and then every 5 years going forward. And if through biochar you can enhance the soil organic carbon component, obviously fantastic. I think there are added benefits to it in terms of the water retention capability thereof, which is also very positive. One should, however, look at it again in a fuller system, because to manufacture biochar is actually quite carbon intensive and quite energy intensive itself. So you have to remove the biomass first, and typically would be invasive alien plants, which is a very labor intensive, energy intensive process, or bush encroachment. You have to remove it. You have to produce the biochar, and then you have to transport it, which is also energy intensive, to the different places, and then distribute it, spread it on your farm, or utilize it in an orchard, or wherever it is being applied. So the entire process of moving one form of carbon, which is a standing stock of carbon, where it is as a tree, there it is a standing stock of carbon, to transport that standing stock of carbon to another destiny, another place, several kilometers, even hundreds of kilometers away, in another form. There's a lot of leakage. I've spoken about the concept of permanence earlier, is that's one of the big buzzwords in this entire industry. The other big buzzword is leakage. So leakage includes that in the process of making this, what are you leaking at another place? And we should just make sure that the net contribution is still positive, and that it is still worth the while from a financial perspective. But that it does contribute to the soil health, that it does add to the water retention capabilities. I mean, I think there are no issues around that. One must just look at the full carbon balance when you do these calculations, that you're not taking a standing stock of carbon, even if it is an invasive alien tree, it's still a standing stock of carbon, and then releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. And then once it's in the soil, you've got enhanced soil respiration as well. And then it is respiring from the soil, that you're not actually adding to the leakage effect. So one must just be careful and mindful that it is not a simple calculation there. There are many other factors in the process that comes into play.
Yeah. Thank you very much, James. And then just in conclusion in that, is there something that we've missed? Or is there something that you actually want to add to the conversation in conclusion?
Through the work that we've done, Gerry, just lastly, and that is that a farmer is a manager and a steward of his land. And the objective must never be to maximize one stream of income from one single source, be that then beef or carbon credits or whatever the case might be. The objective will be to manage the farm as well as he or she can as a steward for future generations. And that involves the building of the carbon of all the different carbon pools. The soil pool is one pool, but we should not get, again, blinkers only on the soil carbon pool. There are many other carbon pools that can be developed. And it's those other carbon pools that actually enhances the resilience of that farm. And those would be the pools that's actually going to carry the farm through difficult times. And that's the exciting bit. The farmer is to adapt, to be nimble in terms of the management of that land and his or her custodianship. And may all the farmers, hats off to them, salute them for the immense work they're doing in being those stewards, building the food stock for the country, but also managing the land under their jurisdictions.
I hope through this discussion we've achieved some clarity for the primary livestock producer, the complexity of carbon credits and carbon accounting. I want to thank you for taking the time to listening to us, and I do hope that it was of value to you. I would like to thank you, James, and your various teams working with you for the work that you are doing. The farmers, wherever you farm in the world, thank you for everything. It's not going to get easier, but it sure is worth the effort. And then just as a last comment, regardless of all our accomplishments, we owe our life to 6 inches of soil and the fact that it rains. Thank you very much.